effective action to bring about systemic change in law enforcement, education, employment and income gap, the limited presence of Blacks in civic governance, and the culture of Jim Crow and white privilege. These are the issues and goals that the Black community in Montgomery County, Virginia have identified and have been taking action to resolve for nearly 10 years. Before we get going, we'll take care of some housekeeping. One of my colleagues, Lisa Garcia, who is also our timekeeper, will give us a quick orientation to Zoom platform that we're using. Lisa?
Thank you, LaTanya. First, I want to welcome everybody to our Summer Summit for Dialogue on Race. We are so excited to have you here today. I just want to give a shout out to the panelists. They have put blood, sweat, and tears into this presentation and practice, practice, practice. And even so, we're going to have some glitches. I saw in the chat somebody said, is LaTanya speaking to us all? Were you able to see her? Were you able to hear her? If not, please go ahead and put in the chat questions. We've got people monitoring that chat and they'll answer your questions. So I'm going to give you a little orientation to doing Zoom webinar. If you've never been on a Zoom webinar before, go to the bottom of your screen. There are several little icons there. You can click the one that says chat and it brings up a window. You can type questions in that window. You can say where you're from. You can give a shout out to a panelist, whatever you'd like to do to engage. There's also one that says Q&A. If you click that icon, you can specifically get questions to our panelists. We won't be able to address all your questions today because we have a limited amount of time, but we will certainly address a few of those and we'll address them in other events later on. So if you have any questions at all, please make sure to get that in the chat. I'll do the best to support our panelists with the technology. We're going to have a little bit of bumps on the way, but we are so glad you are here. Give us grace. We're all volunteers. We're doing the best we can. Thank you for being here. LaTanya?
And I second the grace piece because I'm going to need a lot of it. All right, thank you, Lisa. The aim of the Dialogue on Race Summer Summit is to promote community understanding of racial trauma so that we can be better equipped in our work to combat racism in our community. Our program today has 5 parts, beginning with a video montage of personal videos and stories of racial trauma. Then Dr. Russell Jones, professor of psychology at Virginia Tech University and a clinical psychologist who specializes in trauma psychology, will lead in reflecting on that experience of those stories to help us in understanding the fundamentals of racial trauma. Then I will return and talk with you about Black children in trauma. I identify myself as an infiltrator and I am a licensed clinical social worker working in the Roanoke Valley. Next, my colleague, Dr. Alexa Casey, a licensed clinical psychologist, currently working with veterans in a local agency and works as an equine therapist in Boone's Mill. Alexa will help us understand what makes it difficult for white people to hear stories of racial trauma and what it means to be anti-racist. Then our panelists will speak briefly about actions that have been enacted to reduce and eliminate racism. And we'll share ways you can get engaged in this work so vital for our American democracy. And finally, we will conclude this summit. And if you want to stay on for that question and answer period with our panelists, me included, then you will stay on. Jane Hunley is another of our colleagues, and she is kind of compiling the questions that you will enter in the Q&A portion of Zoom. Jane and Alexa have compiled and produced a Dialogue on Race list of resources for coping with racism and trauma, and that will be available on the Dialogue on Race website at dialogueonrace.info. Let's get started. First video clip will be the 12 Years of Slave, clip from the movie 12 Years a Slave, and then a interview of the former Assistant U.S. Attorney General Roger Wilkins, and finally, an experience shared by Penny Franklin, Montgomery County School Board member and labor union leader. I caution you that the video, at least at the start, the clip from 12 Years a Slave, can be very disturbing and provocative. So I'm going to be your flight attendant for a moment here. You know where the bathrooms are wherever you are. Hopefully you're in a comfortable place. You've got on comfortable pants. And if you are of age, have a glass of wine beside you, maybe some water. I want you to take care of yourself. If you find while watching the videos that maybe your body feels tense, maybe you're not even breathing, I'm going to ask that you take a breath, please. If you are into therapeutic breathing and taking in that breath through the nose and releasing it out through your mouth, so if you're into more controlled breathing, then do that. If that is not your thing, then find your normal pace of breathing. You might just sink into that comfortable seat that you're in. I'm going to ask that you also have maybe a pen and paper or something to jot down some notes, maybe the notepad in your phone, as you go through the video montage. I think the first video is about 3 minutes and some change, so I just want you to be prepared for that. All right, Lisa.
I used to be a runner in high school and college, and in my late 30s, I began to jog. Early wave of joggers, one of the most foolish things I ever did. And I was jogging near my house in Washington. I was an assistant attorney general of the United States, the best friend of the attorney general of the United States, and I was jogging near my house. And a police came by. Fortunately, I had my Justice Department credentials in my hip pocket. Boy! I kept on jogging. My hair was beginning to gray, and then I'm jogging along. Boy! I keep on jogging. Hey, you boy! spotlight on me. Boy, you better stop! I figured I better stop. And so I stop, and two white cops get out, slam me up against a wall, spread my legs, and then spray my legs hit me pretty hard between the legs, and it hurt very much. I kept saying, look in my back pocket, reach in my back pocket. Boy, we're gonna, you robbed a store. Boy this, boy that, boy. They pulled out this thing, and it was a nice leather thing that said I was a Justice Department official. Oh, they melted. Oh, you look just like, we had a call, and you just like, it fits you too, sir, blah, 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 blah. Well, of course, I called the police chief the minute I got home, and those guys were suspended and disciplined. If I had had no credentials in my pocket, I would have been in jail that night. Middle class, 37-year-old father of 2 children, doing nothing more than jogging. And that's not the only time it happened to me. Well, if it would happen to me, imagine what would happen to a 17-year-old black kid in the inner city.
So, my name is Penny Franklin. I'm a lifelong resident of Montgomery County, Virginia, and I want to tell you a story about a situation that was probably one of the most traumatizing I have had in many, many, many years. So I was checking into a high-end resort in Dallas, Texas. I was attending an executive council meeting with my international union. I arrived about 10:30 in the morning and thought I'd probably have to wait for a room, but to my surprise, they put me right in a room. When I got into the room, I have some chemical sensitivities that can cause severe allergic reactions. So after a few minutes, I knew I was going to have to move from that room. I called to let the front desk know that, went back down, explained what the issue was again, and gave them a solution, very simple solution that would take care of the situation. Long story short, it took from approximately 11:15 until almost 6 o'clock that evening for me to get into my room. It was humiliating. I patiently waited for a couple of hours before I went back and asked if the room was ready. And then I was repeatedly told, we're working on it, we're working on it. There was an employee there in the very beginning who heard the conversation and advised her coworker that there was a floor in the hotel that was sort of hyperallergenic. During that time, every time the person would come back, they would have more people with them waiting for me as an angry Black woman to erupt, and then they would take their actions. Well, it is these types of things that cause Black people to become angry, cause us to go through trauma, to feel that we are being treated less than, not given opportunities. I've dealt with this all my life. I heard the word trauma related to race a couple of years ago, and it was an aha, exhaling moment to be vindicated, to understand that yes, what I feel and what I deal with is real. My children, I have watched them have to deal with this, and that's traumatic, having to fight for them. I don't want my grandchildren to have to feel this. I don't want my children to have to constantly be traumatized, watching their children be traumatized. I don't want to be called an angry Black woman just because I want to be treated the way every human being deserves to be treated, with respect and dignity. I want to be given the opportunities that white people have and that they don't even think about. when they get out of bed in the morning, how they're going to have to interact with the world. Folks, you don't understand, and you need to pay attention, and you need to start speaking up when you see and hear situations where Black people are not being treated fairly, not being given opportunities that we deserve just as human beings. Going to the grocery store, watching the clerks to see which one may give me an issue or not treat me the way I want to be treated. You know, listening to make sure that you're getting the same specials and in a department store that may be running specials where the people in front of you may get the coupon, but then you don't get offered that coupon unless you speak to it. This needs to stop. Not getting jobs, being killed just because we're Black, and every day having to live with that. That's trauma. Every day of your life. It's wrong, needs to stop. Thank you. That was 5 minutes. Ooh, that's hard. I thought that would be easy.
I know that a number of the images and sounds that you saw and heard were quite disturbing. What I'd like you to do at this point is to kind of reflect on what you saw and what you heard. We hope to help you capture the moment so that our future will be different. So just kind of pause and reflect. If you would, take a deep breath. Next. So I want you to ask yourself, what did you see? What did you hear? What did you see? Both what we call microaggressions as well as macroaggressions. These are microaggressions. Why are you so mad? Oh, my best friend is Black. Why do I look the way you do? You're basically white. Sorry for that. You don't sound Black. These are what we call microaggressions or macroaggressions. Now, let me just ask you the question. Many of you have heard the term, what doesn't kill you, you finish it, and you're going to say it strengthens you. Well, what we're learning in the field of trauma, that what doesn't kill you weakens you. And what I mean by that, people that go through these day after day, year after year, there can be very negative consequences, psychological consequences, biological, neurobiological, very negative consequences, which can last for a lifetime. Macroaggressions are the killing of an African-American individual with no due cause. You all remember Breonna Taylor, 26-year-old African-American woman was killed in her home. Both micro and macro aggressions occur from race-based trauma. What did you hear? Again, racial slurs and put down. These that go on for a consistent time period, again, can have very negative consequences. Now, I'd like you to engage in an exercise in terms of what emotions that you heard. What were your reactions to what actually took place? I'm going to give you about 3 minutes to bring those up, if you would. How you react physically and emotionally. You might be surprised at what took place. Thank you. You can see that there are a range of physical and emotional reactions. As you look at this, there's anger, there's shame, there's fear, there's anxiety, a number of responses. What some people say, next, what some people say, they might deny it. They may be in disbelief, anger, as I said before. Individuals have said, I have never seen this before. If it does happen, it's infrequent, and that only happens in the Deep South. Feelings of guilt, shame, no big deal, no one was killed. I'm sure they will get over it. Again, different physical and emotional reactions to race-based trauma. Next. We're fortunate today that there were some survivors that actually shared their stories. They told their stories, which is very cathartic. And I'm hoping that by the sharing of the stories, that this is giving you efficacy, giving you motivation, if you will, to share your story at some point in time. I believe that this is the first step to healing. One of the reasons I think that's so important at this time is because of what's going on, what we're seeing, what we're experiencing. There's a term called a syndemic. And what that means, there are two things, bad things that come together at the same time. What are the bad things that are coming together at our time? Both racial upheaval and the pandemic. We conceptualize what you just saw is race-based trauma. It's a traumatic response to stress following a racial encounter. In fact, the theory behind it is that individuals who experience racially charged discrimination as traumatic and often have responses that are comparable to post-traumatic stress disorder. Comparable to post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, when you guys think of, most people think of PTSD, they think of Vietnam, they think of other wars where men have been in battle, and consequently, they develop a number of symptoms. But the point that I want to make here is that individuals who experience extreme race-based trauma can, in fact, develop a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. There are a number of causes of post-traumatic stress disorder. That is, you can actually experience a threatening event or being injured. There can be a threatened, injured event or killed. That's called an indirect. Or hearing about someone threatened, injured, or killed could be a close relative or friend. Varying ways of developing post-traumatic stress disorder. Let's just quickly go to symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. There are a number of them. You may have experienced these yourselves, whether white or black. Disturbing memories, dreams, flashbacks. Flashbacks are reliving it. Avoiding people, places, and things. Many individuals, clients have shared with me, those individuals that were raped, for example, they want to avoid people that look like the rapist, places that they were at that time, and reminders of the event. Also, one has less ability to think, learn, and problem solve. When people experience these types of events that you saw, their ability to think is severely compromised. In fact, there are data to say that the frontal lobe actually shuts down, lessening your ability to learn, lessening your ability to problem solve and move forward. There's also anger, which came up many times in the chat there. Sleep disturbances, hypervigilance. What is hypervigilance? Well, individuals following fires and hurricanes that we've studied oftentimes will say that they're always looking out for danger. That is, they're fearful that the thing that happened earlier will happen again and they'll perish. So again, guys, a number of symptoms making up post-traumatic stress disorder. Next slide. And again, people that experienced a number of these symptoms, in fact, 6 for over a month period of time, may develop post-traumatic stress disorder. very serious disorder, but again, can be correlated with racial stress and trauma. Clients have often said following these kind of events that I lost my identity. I'm not the same person I used to be. I'll never be the same. Again, a disorder that actually takes your identity. Next. A question that's often asked is, why don't they just get over it? No big deal. These are bad things, but why don't they just get over it? Let me tell you a little bit about why they don't just get over it. There are traumatic reminders and triggers. Probably heard the term triggers more than traumatic reminders. It's things that we see, touch, taste, hear, and smell. How many of you remember after Hurricane Katrina, I had a number of parents that would come up to me and say, Dr. Jones, my child or my adolescent is reluctant to take showers or baths. Why? It was a traumatic event, a traumatic reminder rather. It reminded them of the flood waters. In terms of 416 here at Virginia Tech, many students shared that they, in fact, when they saw emergency vehicles, they would in fact be triggered and it would all come back. It would flood back. Again, traumatic reminders and triggers. Next. Let me ask you, how many of you remember where you were and what you were doing following the Sandy Hook shooting, as well as 9/11? Yeah, most of you do. Where you were and what you were doing. Next. Now, why is that? Well, the brain, we're wired that way. The brain sees to it that we're wired that way, that we do indeed remember traumatic events. Now, we don't only remember traumatic events, we also remember good events. But the traumatic events have a little more heft to them, if you will. So a little bit more about that in just a second. Next. This is a universal phenomenon. Everybody experiences it, the ability to remember and recall. Black, white, male, female. It happens to people around the world. So we're wired that way to remember these types of events. Now, take a moment with me, if you will, to just think about something. I'm going to ask you to do two things in just a minute. I'm going to ask you to think about perhaps the best day of your life and perhaps the worst day of your life. Now, if you're in a safe place, I'd like you to briefly close your eyes, and I'm going to ask you to think about each of these. So first of all, think of the best day of your life. Now, think about the worst day of your life. Now, did you notice a difference between the two, the best day and the worst day? The best day, you probably felt as if you were floating on air. Things couldn't be better. But how about the worst day? Typically, people who think of the worst day, they will experience a heaviness. It's weightier. It affects you biologically. It affects you physically, neurobiologically. You may feel depressed. You may feel that the wind is taken from you. You may feel muscle tension. Again, point being here that we remember different things, but they have different weights to them. Those negative traumatic experiences are much weightier than the good experiences and are much longer lasting than the best days. So again, why don't you people, just get over it? The cause, again, are triggers.
You will not replace us. You
And remember that one of the most powerful resources, or sources rather, of triggers is the media. That's why we tell young children not to watch the media, parents to not let their children watch media, because again, it brings back up those bad feelings, those bad circumstances, those biological, psychological phenomenon that keep the traumatic event alive. What's important, the next step, is to tell your story. There's something cathartic about telling the story. Let me just briefly take you to two tragic situations where telling the story was very important. A number of you might remember the story of Emmett Till. He was a 14-year-old African-American adolescent who had gone to visit his cousins in Mississippi. He had an encounter with a white woman who accused him of saying socially appropriate things and even touching her. That night, Emmett Till, 14-year-old African-American adolescent, was lynched. What you see before you is his mother standing over the grave or the tomb, the casket rather. And what's interesting about that, it's opened. She refused to close the casket because she wanted her story told. She wanted the nation to see what they had done to her son. Now, you might think that this is just kind of an African-American thing. This is a cultural thing that they do. No, 8 years later, Jackie Kennedy, after the death of President Kennedy, was told not to go before the national media, national news, with a suit on that had blood on it. She refused to do so for the same reason that Emmett Till's mother refused to close the casket. She says, I want America to know what they've done to my husband and our president. Now think about it. Anybody that's experienced a loss of a spouse, of a child, of a close relative, there's something about not forgetting that person, remembering what took place, reminding people what took place. I'm often reminded following 416, and one of our sayings was, we will never forget. Something very cathartic and meaningful about that. So again, it's important for you to identify your story, to describe your story, to talk it out, and to dismantle it. It's a very difficult thing to do for many people, but it can in fact take place. And in fact, if you can't do this on your own, there are a number of what we call evidence-based interventions that have been scientifically proven to help people who experience post-traumatic stress disorder or subclinical levels of post-traumatic stress disorder. And they work for many people. However, they may not work for everybody. They may not work as well for African Americans. Why? Well, there are a number of reasons why African Americans don't go to therapists. And they have to do with trust, not trusting white therapists, not trusting society, due to things like the Tuskegee experiment. It could also be access, just not having the time and the financial wherewithal to pay to get to a therapist and someone to take care of the children. And last but not least, not understanding the culture and having the linguistic ability to relate to African Americans and other people of color. So what do you do in that situation? Next, please. Social support is often the #1 protective factor following a traumatic event. Flood, fire, we've seen it many, many times. What else? Faith, very effective. And again, many situations, a lot of data to support it. Prayer can be very effective. Forgiveness can be very effective. And in fact, if you look at the daily news here, one of the things that was discussed was the way that people in South Carolina, following the massacre, were able to forgive the shooter. We also were able to show some data, some initial data, that showed that students here at Virginia Tech who forgave the shooter were able to move forward in a number of dimensions. So again, forgiveness, very important. Dialogue, and last but not least, again, telling your story. Next. So a message to our white brothers and sisters is use your privilege to empower Blackness. And what do I mean by that? Using your privilege to empower Blackness is to help break down racist systems, policies, and practices. Things that you're aware of, things that you may have participated in. Use your privilege to break those systems down. And also commit to being anti-racist. That is, to fight these kind of situations whenever possible, to identify them, dismantle them, and help folk move forward. Next. I want to end here with Mr. Wilkins. And this is what he said, and I think this is very, very apropos for this time that we find ourselves in. And he said, we have no hope of solving our problems without harnessing the diversity, the energy, the creativity of all our people. I'm excited. I have hope for this moment that we're in. The racial trauma, the pandemic. I'm excited because so many people are coming together. So many people are getting it. So many people are being exposed to something that they've never been exposed before or didn't take note of it. The slide before was a slide of the students and many others here in Blacksburg engaging in peaceful protests, and not only here in Blacksburg, but all around the world. All around the world. I think this is a good time. I think it can be a better time as we move forward by coming together in unity, in peace, and hope. I hope we're capturing the moment, and I hope what's been shared and what will be shared will give us all steps for transforming the future. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jones.
All right, I am back. I'm going to share my screen. So again, remember that thing about grace. Don't forget that. And I'm going to stop my video so you all can focus on the PowerPoint. All right, and as I mentioned before, I'm LaTanya Bolden. My portion is focusing on Black children in trauma. I titled this portion From the Womb to the Tomb. Well, of course, I can't talk about children without talking about adults and or reflecting on adults. And I will list the impact of racial trauma from the beginning, even before birth, and the lasting effects that it has across a child's lifespan. So Dr. Jones kind of shared a definition of racial trauma. I'm sure there are multiple. This one is taken from Mental Health America. Racial trauma or race-based traumatic stress refers to mental and emotional injury caused by encounters of racial bias and ethnic discrimination, racism, hate, and crime. We got to talk about the beginning. And while the date may be debatable in terms of when were the first Africans brought to these shores, and I think what is debatable is that it may have been sooner rather than 1619, but that wasn't good either way, right? Okay, and so I want to talk about epigenetics. I want to talk about the impact on the biology of the children that you see in your schools, in your churches, in your community groups, in your neighborhood, and how might they be impacted. So this is the simplest definition I could find for epigenetics, and so hopefully you'll follow. It literally means above or on top of genetics. It refers to external modifications to the DNA that turns genes off and on. Epigenetic changes have been thought to attribute to certain individual vulnerabilities and can increase the propensity of mental illness, social and emotional development, including conditions such as depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, which Dr. Jones covered. In recent years, much attention continues to be focused on the extent in which epigenetics changes from traumatic experiences. So how does that change us as individuals biologically? Most of the research on epigenetics has been focused on victims of the Holocaust and their descendants, children and grandchildren. So let's get into what are the barriers even before birth. So racism and exploitation of Black bodies is common practice in our yesterday and today. Study interviews of medical students in the early 2000s, and I think most recently I read a study from 2016, revealed that medical students believed Black patients to have tougher skin, to be able to endure severe pain for longer periods of time. One of many infamous exploiters of the Black bodies was J. Marion Sims, and some of his victims I will name: Lucy, Betsy, and Anarcha. And the latter, Miss Anarcha, endured at least 30 surgeries, and of course, all without anesthesia. And there were many other enslaved women. And let's talk about the exploitation even after death. Let us not forget Henrietta Lacks. According to the CDC in 2017, Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related issues than white women, regardless of that individual Black woman's education or socioeconomic status. Black infants die twice the rate of white infants. So if we have one at home, it is indeed a miracle. And if we've survived delivery, it is indeed a miracle. All right. And cultural erasure and hair discrimination. So even in our great Commonwealth, just a few months ago, 6 months ago or so, in March, Virginia passed the Hair Discrimination Act, because it was literally a thing to wear your hair how it naturally grows out of your head. And so that brings us to the thought, or maybe not the thought, but the need for some education about cultural racism. And I am taking this from Dieta James. You will not see the definition on your slide. Cultural racism has several meanings. In the larger sense, it is the authority to create and define the culture in society. In America, the standards of art, beauty, and other forms of culture have historically been decided by straight, white Christian men. As a result, the dominant American culture often reflects the needs of that group while excluding or devaluing the contributions of people of color. Therefore, in America, the holidays we celebrate, the statues in our parks, the stories in our history books, and other markers of culture generally honor white men to the exclusion of other groups. And again, that's a quote from Dieta James. And again, while we're talking about the exploitation of bodies or the oppression of the body, I want to just bring to your awareness of 2 children in particular. There are many others, unfortunately, that have been murdered while just being them, just being children. So on your screen, you see Ayanna Jones, died at age 7. She was shot in the head by police officers that were raiding her home while she was asleep. And Tamir Rice was 12 and playing in a park with a toy gun and was murdered. Again, both of these murders by police officers within several seconds of their arrival to Ayana's home and to the park where young Tamir Rice was playing. And there are many other racial inequities that affect Black children. So in 2017, the Federal Reserve reported that Black Americans have 1/10 of the net worth of white Americans. And Black women earn somewhere between 60 to 65 cents to every dollar a white man makes. And there is some information and research out there about how many extra months would a Black woman have to make to earn that dollar. Lower wages result in parental and family stress, shame, depression. Parents spend more time away from home, creates a lack of nurturance, attunement, and supervision of the child, as well as it limits access to food, shelter, clothing, healthcare, and other basic needs. And here's the question. Did you receive an education or an indoctrination? And this is a question for both white and Black. This is a question for our Latinx brothers and sisters, our Native brothers and sisters. Did you receive an education or an indoctrination? So in 2015, one of the leading distributors and maybe publishers of textbooks, McGraw-Hill, identified enslaved people as workers brought from Africa to the southern US. Now, while that was corrected, the questions are, why was it ever considered a way to frame chattel slavery? Were the educators teaching from that text not outraged? Consider, what are the benefits to erasing history? What's the cost to those that are erased? And any educators on the webinar joining us today, think about how our current educational system and curriculums, think about those. And what's the impact on how Black children see themselves? Do they see themselves? And this happens to be one of my favorite slides here. And that is reflection and representation. And this is taken from O Magazine, a photo essay. I think it's just a great juxtaposition of what a typical toy aisle in your local stores would look like, where a majority of the dolls would be white and the young child standing in front may be Black or brown. And how, as a Black parent, we have to be very conscious of the decisions we make about the images that our children see, that are a reflection of their complexion or a reflection of their hair. And the plague and pride of being seen as, or maybe being made to be seen as, strong. How does that narrative impact who and when, if we seek help at all? Religious indoctrination. So I know there may be some church folk out there in Zoom universe, and I don't want to step on anyone's toes. Religion can be important. Prayer and spirituality are important to helping us to be resilient. However, sometimes some of the messages may impact a person seeking professional help when it's needed. The experience of providers over pathologizing certain behaviors and symptomology while ignoring others, resulting in problematic diagnosing, and therefore children not getting the appropriate services that they may need. From personal experience and working with psychiatrists, I have witnessed this, and I'll share this example. 2 children who identified as male, 1 Black, 1 white, both of the same age. One in their psychosocial assessment was said to be breaking into cars and breaking into homes. And the other child was having some anger outburst in school. The child who was breaking and entering was diagnosed with depression. He was white. And the child who was experiencing anger outburst at school was Black and diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder. And I could get into that a little bit more. So what I'm finding is that oftentimes Black children, trauma is not even a thing that people are assessing for and appropriately diagnosing. I'll put it that way. And I think that there is a root here, and I want to talk about that. So Dr. Samuel A. Cartwright was a well-respected physician. And back in the antebellum, he diagnosed or developed 2 unique diseases for African Americans. And one was called drapetomania, a disease which causes slaves to run away. Because why would someone want to run away from being enslaved? Okay. And then the second one was, I'm going to try to pronounce this, dysphagia, a disease causing rascality and laziness in Black people, free and enslaved. And so how is that perpetuated in our mental health systems? I guarantee you it is. I know it is based on some of the diagnoses that children receive. And then there's health disparities. I don't have a slide for that. We all know the impact of food deserts and how those are disproportionately in communities of color, the rates of chronic disease, and the environmental factors in communities of color. And then again, the discrimination in treatment from medical providers. And of course, we all know the impact of poor nutrition and the politics of food and other things. In fact, you could choose any of the areas I just covered that might be of interest to you, and then frame it with how does this affect African American people, and you have found your passion and your cause, and a way to utilize your privilege to empower others. So this next slide, I want to go ahead and preference and say, I am not diagnosing anyone today, and I don't advise you to do that either. So while I am going to be using some generalizations, I don't want you to go out and then see the little Black boy that's playing on the corner and assume something about who he is. Let me be very clear. So I want to call your attention to and your consideration of the inner workings of a person, you included. And how do you respond when you are under stress? What is kind of automatic to you? And then I'm going to ask, wherever you are, hopefully you're comfortable, and hopefully for sure you are safe. And I want for you, if you can, close your eyes or not close your eyes, but imagine, everybody has a favorite movie scene that takes place in New York, and there are cabs honking their horns and people yelling and screaming and lots of action on that street. And think about that, those sounds that you might hear. And for a moment, I just want you to imagine that that might be the internal workings of a child who tends to externalize. That means show how they feel on the outside. So for instance, thinking about anger, that child might be more aggressive than other children. Maybe they can't sit still. And maybe they seem to demonstrate, or what might be perceived as, an unwillingness to follow directions. And now I want you to change your scene for a moment and imagine yourself in a closet. Imagine the worst horror movie you've ever seen. And there's always a character that's locked in a closet, locked in a car, and the horror character is moving towards them. And we know that music that's typically played at that time. And imagine that maybe that child, imagine a child that maybe internalizes, and that is what they hear or can see. That's the way they are experiencing the world. And that child might be a little more nervous, appear very sad maybe, or withdrawn. And then lastly, I'm going to ask you this. When you think about those children that you've seen at church, in your classrooms, in your community, and maybe you probably immediately went to the child that you find to be the most challenging. And I'm going to ask you, are you only looking at that child's behavior? And if the answer is yes, then I want you to continue to follow me. And now I want you to see that child. So that means you need to make less judgments, ask more questions, take a little bit longer with your observations. And the last part of my part of the presentation, Penny asked for me to say something or speak to the talk. And most of you have probably heard of that. And if you haven't, it is really a discussion about survival that most Black and African American parents will have with their children. The preparation for survival and really the constant state of living, the constant state of being in survival mode. The talk reveals, or maybe confirms, the world as an unsafe place. The pressure for excellence, making sure you get it all right, that you don't appear too loud, too big, too dark. And it is the absolute denial of a child's humanness. And white folks should be aware there are multiple kinds of talks. Some I've covered and others I have not included. Conversations like about the child's hair, their skin color, the volume of their voice, the laughter, and how that may be interpreted as ghetto or hood. The talk might include being mindful of how you gather with other Black children for fear that you may be perceived as a gang. Placating white people for safety purposes. Being mindful of the clothing that your child wears, the colors. Don't wear a hood in the store. Don't wear your hat to the back. Your hoop shouldn't be too big. Your color shouldn't be so loud or bright. And providing supplemental education on history because it isn't documented in our textbooks. Interactions with law enforcement, etc. The list could go on. We could do a whole panel on that. And then how does this constant state of survival show up in children? Well, I think there is an experience of grief and loss, not only for the children, but also for parents of Black children. The fact that we have to witness our children awakening to the world not being safe. How can Black parents or African American parents help children? Well, how can we help them to learn to advocate for themselves in our absence? We have to help provide language to describe their experiences. We have to encourage them to speak up and out. We have to validate what that feels like for them. We have to protect them. And I think it's important that in school systems and communities at large, that there is some type of establishment of parent advocacy groups and support groups. And my last remarks are consider the attachment injuries that are constant for Black children and their parents, the relational shifts when we want to hold our children close and keep them safe, but we know that the world perceives them as a threat. And no one provides a better description of that than Dr. Joy DeGruy, and she coined the term post-traumatic slave syndrome. And I'm gonna play a quick video for you. It is about 3 minutes long. And do you have that, Lisa?
I do. Do you want me to do that?
Would you please?
I will. Absolutely. Oh, I don't have it up. Do you have the?
Okay, I can do it.
I thought you were going to do it. I'm sorry.
You all just be patient with me, because I got to remember where I go. So I got to do a new share. And okay, I think that is set up to do it.
Trauma, no help, freed. No help, more trauma. If it's a sustained trauma, then the impact of that is also sustained. When we look at multi-generational trauma, we're looking at people who are maybe victims of natural disasters and their families and their children and generations of folks who have experienced war. And we know that there are residual mental, emotional, traumatic impact. And what I did was I started to look at the African American experience, starting with slavery, as a real clear, long enduring trauma. I started to see that there were clear connections between that survival behavior and contemporary living in African American experience. I started to see common behaviors that I took for granted as, well, cultural. There's adaptive behaviors, survival behaviors. Well, what are they? Let's just say 2019, you have a Black mother and a white mother. The sons go to school together. They find themselves at a meeting. The Black mother leans over to the white mother and says, I just wanted to mention to you that I noticed that your son is really doing quite well. And the white mother's response is, oh, thank you. She begins to go on and on about he won the science fair, his uncle's an astronaut. She's just oozing. She realizes the Black mother's son is actually excelling her son. And she says, well, wait a minute. Your son's the one that's really coming along. And the Black mother responds, oh my God, he's a handful, but oh, he just works my nerves. Now, when I'm working with African American people, it doesn't matter what the audience is. It doesn't matter what class. If I were to ask, is she very proud while she's saying those denigrating things? And everybody laughs and goes, of course, there's a secret. Because everybody Black knows that even though the Black mother is going, oh my God, she's really proud. So now let's roll that scene back 300 years. And let's say this Black mother is working in the fields, and a white slave owner comes through and says, wow, that boy is really coming along. What is she gonna say? No, he's not. He's stupid. He's shiftless. He can't work. Because I don't want you to sell him. So I denigrate them to protect them. That is called appropriate adaptation when living in a hostile environment. The little white boy, say Timmy, he feels really comfortable and happy about what his mom just said about him. And Trey looks at his mom and wonders, why can't you be proud of him? Because he doesn't understand the secret yet. And by the time he learns the secret, he will have already been injured by it. Post-traumatic slave syndrome.
All right. I am gonna screen share my PowerPoint again here. Folks can hear me?
We can hear you, and
All
your
right.
screen is not in full screen mode. If you could.
Oh, righty, thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, well, here we go. Fast forward.
That is okay.
There we go. All right, folks. Well, that concludes my portion. But before I say that, I shouldn't have said that. I want to make sure that I say a little something about that video. That is not for folks to go out and interpret that that is how all African-American parents are with their children. I hope I was heard loud and clear out in Zoom universe. Okay. And you have my contact information below. And thank you very much.
Thank you, LaTanya.
Hi, everyone. Yes. Hi, my name is Alexa Casey. I'm here today to talk about the dynamics of how whites can play a constructive role in addressing the problems of racial trauma. My goal is to propose different ways for white people to think about racism and the positive impact that they can have today. Let's begin with Black Lives Matter. Please take a few minutes to consider your own reactions to Black Lives Matter. Share your impressions about the name, what they do, and how you feel about what is happening. Keep those thoughts and ideas for yourself. We'll come back to it later. What does racism look like? What are some thoughts you are having about racial trauma? I am confident that most of us on this webinar have very similar views about racism. We find the idea of racial superiority to be reprehensible. We are angered by white people who openly denigrate people of color, and we are shocked and discouraged by what happened in Charlottesville. The inhumane treatment of immigrants and children put in cages, as well as the brutal death of George Floyd by the police, has now sent millions of white people to protest along with blacks in the streets. The orange-haired man in office is yet another testament to how ingrained our racism is and has been. I think it's safe to say that many of us here are quite appalled at the clear racist behaviors running rampant in our country today. Most of us would agree with the following. I am not a racist. I believe that all people are equal. I do not believe that race determines whether a person has more or less worth. On a conscious level, we are clearly in support of equality among the races and believe everyone is created equal. As whites, many of us identify as being on the right side of this issue. We are in support of equal rights for blacks, for women, for those of a different sexual orientation, and so forth. We have no doubts that everyone was created equal and are comfortable speaking up when clear violations have occurred. Many of us are not happy with our current state of the world. It appears that the current civil rights movement may prove as a catalyst to even greater changes in our institutions that has potential to make a real difference in Black lives and other people of color. We shall see. Now, before I move on, I want to discuss self-deception. To begin, most of us are programmed to have a positive image of ourselves. While we may have had a critical parent in our childhood, we still aim to see ourselves as caring, thoughtful, and knowing. We establish belief systems that often reinforce our sense of self. These belief systems often make it difficult to view anything that might tarnish our more positive view of ourselves or bring to question our skills and abilities. Sometimes good people do bad things, and it's difficult to explore that darker side. Research has shown that seeing ourselves in the most positive terms is adaptive and actually elevates our social status. Because of our own self-bias, information presented to us that might cast us in a negative light will most likely be rejected, often automatically. Our aim, often unconscious, is to bolster our own sense of self. We will continue to find proof to reinforce our positive self-image, also referred to as a confirmation bias. At the same time, we will deny or ignore any evidence that would suggest that we aren't capable or intelligent or willing to do the right thing in a difficult time. Overall, it can be very difficult to view ourselves in a negative light. This bias often leads to self-deception, which in my opinion gets in the way of white people truly understanding what it means to be Black in America. To begin, we may tell ourselves the following: I have many Black friends. I'm colorblind, I don't see color. I belong to the NAACP and support them financially. I've attended many Black Lives Matter protests. All of these ideas reinforce our positive image of ourselves as being on the right side of race relations, but they do little to help us understand what is happening and how to approach the problems of institutional and systematic racism in America.
I played 400 rounds of Monopoly with you, and I had to play and give you every dime that I made. And then for 50 years, every time that I played, if you didn't like what I did, you got to burn it like they did in Tulsa and like they did in Rosewood. How can you win? How can you win? You can't win. The game is fixed. So when they say, why do you burn down the community? Why do you burn down your own neighborhood? It's not ours. We don't own anything. We don't own anything. Trevor Noah said it so beautifully last night. There's a social contract that we all have, that if you steal or if I steal, then the person who is the authority comes in and they fix the situation. But the person who fixes the situation is killing us. So the social contract is broken. And if the social contract is broken, why the do I give a shit about burning the Football Hall of Fame, about burning the Target? You broke the contract.
What I'm going to share is a bit trickier to hear. As I mentioned, self-deception is a powerful influence. What happens next is that it's easy to say that it has nothing to do with you and this is not who you are. Please keep that in mind, and I'm asking you to hang in there with me without shutting down. Most people will tend to shut down because this is difficult to hear and even harder to accept. And it runs counter to our conscious beliefs about race. It's a paradox. We can look at historical examples where George Mason, who authored the Virginia Bill of Rights, and refused to sign the Constitution because it did not free slaves. Even Benjamin Franklin, an ardent spokesperson against slavery, had slaves. So here are some issues that have to be explored further and can be rather difficult. These issues we are facing today are not new. Many whites have done very little to engage in the political process in order to reduce the gap between blacks and whites. Social scientists have grappled with how the vast majority of white Americans are committed to the principle of racial equality while simultaneously rejecting policies that would close the gap. In other words, white people aren't doing enough to help blacks and actively rejecting policies that could help blacks. Consider that over 50% of Trump supporters believe that blacks are more violent and criminal than whites, but around 30% of the Hillary supporters believe the same. 40% of Trump supporters believe that black people are lazier than whites, and over 25% of Hillary supporters have believed the same. It's clear that white Democrats also hold racist views too. Liberal and progressive whites may express very strong sentimentality, but at the same time do nothing to help move policy that would reduce inequality between blacks and whites. Feeling angry without action isn't helpful. On a more personal level, whites won't confront others who show a lack of respect for blacks or other people of color. They often look the other way when people share off-color or racist jokes. Staying out of conflict or being quiet doesn't support blacks. Or maybe your white daughter calls you from college and shares that she is dating a black guy. You worry more about that relationship than you did last year when she was dating a white guy. And you tell yourself that you're worried about how others will treat the new couple. You're okay with blacks as long as they don't become part of your own family. As a white person, you are discouraged about the racial inequality, and you tell yourself you don't have much control and you really can't do anything about it, so you do nothing about it. You find justification for not taking action because it seems too overwhelming. So you vent over coffee, but you stop there and feel like you're doing something important. But guess what? You're not. The area that is much more difficult to work through are the unconscious beliefs that we have about race and that we have had from our conditioning, from our own upbringing. We learn from our families, our communities, how to think about Blacks and whites. And while we may believe very differently than our own families taught us, our conditioning is still with us. And these unconscious beliefs continue to influence us and the choices that we make. How was it for you to consider the examples listed above? Did one or more apply to you? If so, are you willing to tackle it so that what you do will matter to truly help Black lives? Besides being aware of how self-deception can negatively impact on truly understanding what it means to be Black in America, I believe it's important for white people to strive for greater understanding, not to assume they know what it means to be Black in America. I'd like to share a brief story about myself and my own ignorance. Recently, I read a book by Matt Rudd called Lovecraft Country. Atticus, a Black man, embarks on a road trip across 1950s Jim Crow America in search of his missing father. When driving from one place to another, Atticus had to be very aware of being pulled over by the police because it was extremely dangerous. It was not just the police, but other whites as well that he ran into. The author provided very specific detail about all the things that Atticus had to anticipate in order to deal with the police when he was pulled over, where to keep his hands, what to say, what not to say. I was shocked to learn about how something that seemed so simple, driving from one place to another, could be so dangerous. What I also was very surprised about is that I had never really considered how terrifying this must have been for Blacks who were just trying to survive. Living a normal life, but not really living a normal life. The blatant disregard for them as human beings was maddening. I was ashamed that I didn't have a clear understanding about what it meant to be Black in America until reading this book. I suppose I had in an abstract way, but I didn't really get the details that I did when reading this book and how frightening it must have been just to drive in the 50s. But really, has that changed? In reading this book, I understood that I knew very little about racial trauma, and I had a lot to learn. Another difference is that I was reading a story at my leisure, but I realized it's real life for Blacks who have to deal with these threats on a daily basis. While it is fiction, Matt Rudd clearly highlighted truth about being Black in America during Jim Crow, and it made me realize how much more Blacks have to think about, plan for, and manage. This, on top of all of the other inequity they are dealing with in our system. Blacks have to act in order to ensure that whites are comfortable. Some of the unwritten rules might include don't get too angry, don't act too smart, be agreeable, smile, etc. Even our two-term Black president had to work hard to appear unthreatening, loyal, and generally happy with a limitless capacity to forgive. As a white person, we don't have to worry about the same things that Blacks have to worry about. Here are just some examples. Being wrongly accused for murder and going to jail without representation, being refused for a mortgage, being refused for service from a store, being ridiculed for being a different race, being told that they're less intelligent. All of these are completely invisible to white people, and not knowing that it exists is part of the problem. Without the knowledge, it makes it difficult to truly understand what it's like to be Black in America. At times, there are things that we might say to ourselves that prevents greater understanding. For example, it doesn't help to say, my other Black friend is fine with this. Why do Blacks use the N-word and I can't? We had a Black president, it's all good now, right? These statements again reinforce our image of ourselves and prevent us from true understanding. In my opinion, it's not enough to be on the right side of the issue. We need to understand, listen to the problems, and recognize that while we are equal, we do not have an equal playing field. As whites, we do not understand the rules in the same way because they do not apply to us. We do not have to think ahead and plan in the same ways. For example, we don't have to talk with our children about how to handle racism. It can be a choice for whites, but not for blacks. But along with understanding and truly listening, we need to act and do things which support equality and work to make lives for blacks better than they are. We must be active participants in creating social justice for blacks, not just have the correct position on race equality. It takes time and a willingness to be uncomfortable. I hope you felt a little uncomfortable today. If you did, that is a good sign. It is the right beginning. Here are some steps to address our unconscious beliefs and begin to truly deal with aspects of race. First of all, be willing to see it. Work beyond the ideas you have about race. Be willing to explore your own background and conditioning. Be willing to ask yourself the following questions. What did you learn about race growing up, and from whom? Were there conflicting messages from different cultural subgroups or individuals in your life? What did you do with that information? How did it shape you? Do you believe people of color when they describe experiences of discrimination? Teach yourself more about race. Listen, ask questions. Don't shut down if the information is difficult to hear. Act. Do something different. Be an anti-racist. Dr. Jones referred to it in his presentation. There's a good list. Go through that list. Now let's go back to what I originally asked you to do. Look at what you said about Black Lives Matter. When I first heard the name, I thought that a different name would work better. The retort of all lives matter seemed too easy. However, considering the real-life experiences Blacks go through, the inequity in the system, the blatant racism by exclusion, and being treated less than, and all the racial trauma we spoke about today, illustrate how Black lives don't matter. And then I realized that Black Lives Matter is the perfect name. And it makes complete sense to me now. I hear it now as a positive message to remind us that together we can work to make Black lives matter. As whites, we must work together with Blacks and be willing to use our privilege to make Black lives better. It's not enough just to be on the right side. We all need to be as angry about these policies that cause inequities for Blacks as if they were happening to us. We need to be in it together. Action is needed, not just understanding. Once we have created policies and institutions that generate genuine equality and help Black lives matter, we can dispense of the group completely because we have accomplished our goal to ensure that Black lives matter in the United States. We have a lot of work to do. Are you ready to help us? Thank you for being here today.
We're coming to the end. The knowledge and understanding about racism must give rise to action for change. In this part of the program, Penny will share a few examples of work that has been done and what you can do to take action to get engaged in combating racism. Penny?
I want to thank everyone for being here with us today. I want you to understand that dialogue on race is not about sitting around and just talking. It's about taking action. We talked about this in the beginning in 2013 when we introduced the issues that the African American community in Montgomery County said are important to us that need to change around law enforcement. In law enforcement, the actions that have been taken is now in Montgomery County, every child will have 2 years of free community college education because of a conversation about race and the barriers to African Americans being involved in the law enforcement, being involved in law enforcement, as employed in law enforcement. Education, questioning and holding the school system to producing the data and producing a better result around discipline and the income gap for our children. The employment income gap group challenged our local government to ban the box on their applications. So now in all 3 jurisdictions, the county, Christiansburg and Blacksburg, the question, have you committed a felon, is no longer on their applications. We're running short on time, but I want to tell you about a couple of other events that are coming up. We're using this tool to talk to you about racial trauma as a tool to help you understand why you have to act, why you have to be engaged. So in September, our law enforcement issue group will be holding a webinar talking about racial trauma and the impact there. In October, our education group will be holding a webinar talking about racial trauma and the impact in our educational system and how we have to bring about change. I want to thank all the folks who have been engaged in this. It has been many, many hours. Our panelists have worked so hard, and their message has just been absolutely on target. So if you watched it and you have friends that haven't, show them, tell them how to find the recording and watch this message and to be engaged. We need everyone to step up and take their role in this. No longer, like I said, I don't want to see my grandchildren have to go through what my mother went through, what I have gone through, my children. I don't want my children to have to be there. Again, you can't understand the amount of time that Lisa Garcia and Andy Morikawa have put in to make sure that you're getting this message, to make sure that we have the setup to do this. It has just taken a lot of time. So if those of you who want to stay with us, we are going to hang around to answer questions that you have put into the chat. We again want to thank you for being here with us, and I hope I haven't left anything out. This work is so important, and it's going to take all of us to make it happen. I was watching a movie the other day, and at the very end there was a quote or a message that one of the characters said. They said, "We don't change the world." So if you're sitting around looking at things, thinking that's terrible, that's awful, that shouldn't happen, oh, that's just awful. Well, you're not changing the world. You're not doing anything but leaving us practically the way we were when we did the Middle Passage from Africa to these shores. I'm tired of being in chains. I need you to live in this world. I need you to understand what your role is. And your role is to help stop the racist systems that we have in this country. Because it's those systems that keep things held back. As individuals, it's kind of hard to hold people back. But when you put systems in place to make sure that folks are held back, held down, and killed, that's what has to change. Thank you.
Thank you, Penny. We appreciate your time and effort, and thank you for all the many hundreds of hours, thousands of hours of service on the Montgomery County School Board. It's just an incredible gift you've given. So folks, like Penny said, we're just a little bit over. We're 7 minutes over what we promised we would be. Many hours went into the panelists getting the content as clean and as crisp as we could with the time we had. We're going to now have a short Q&A, and I believe Jane Hunley is going to help with that. Jane, there are some questions in the Q&A box. I don't know if you want to direct those to the panelists, and I would ask that all the panelists please turn on your video at this time. I'll turn mine off, and Jane will give you questions for each of you to answer, and we will make sure if we don't get to your questions that we will address them in some other fashion.
Yes, I've been going through some of these, and again, I want to say, along with everyone else, most of the comments have been, thank you so much, panelists, for all your hard work and what you've shared. It's important. One of the questions which I I guess I'll address this to Russell, since you brought this up to start with, but any of the panelists can respond. There was a question about the recommendation that we find forgiveness. And this person was asking, does asking Blacks to forgive yet again in some ways contribute to the racial trauma?
Well, that's a very good question. And I guess I could answer it a couple of different ways. I think forgiveness, personally, under any condition, can be very helpful. You know, as I said before, there's a lot of data to support that. I think if the person's intent is genuine, they may not have the full understanding of what they're asking to be forgiven for. They may not realize the complexity in terms of what African Americans go through. But I think forgiveness is a very important first step. Again, it's been shown time after time after time. It's a great first step to moving forward. Thank you so much for your question.
Okay, would any of the other panelists like to respond to that? No?
I will. Can you all hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think forgiveness is an individual thing. In some of the experiences I've had when I visited South Africa and hearing about some of those individuals' capacity to forgive, that's foreign to me. So for me as an individual, if I had to endure some of the severe trauma that those folks have endured, and we have plenty of those experiences here, I don't know that I could. And I don't see forgiveness as a one-shot deal whenever we do choose to forgive. It may be something that you may have to choose moment to moment to do about the same issue, the same circumstance, the same individual. So I think that is up to that individual whether they should. But to that question about whether it is an added burden, I think that yes, the way that our society is structured, it is almost like we are expected to forgive. And again, it is up to that individual.
Okay, thank you, LaTanya. I have another question from a couple of folks asked in different ways this same question, and that is, and Alexa, perhaps I'll address this one to you, but again, other people can respond. There's some folks said that there's a fear amongst whites that even with well-intentioned attempts to be helpful, there is this perception and sometimes this labeling as trying to be a white hero, or what's called getting your allied cookies, and that it's an uncomfortable accusation or depiction for whites to know when is it really helpful and when is what they're doing somehow offensive.
Okay, well, I'll take a stab at that and just say that I think probably one of the things that I find that is probably the most important is to really develop a relationship with somebody and really understand. And I think part of the problem is not asking more questions, not being to have a really good idea about what the problem is, and sometimes jumping in too soon, too quickly to come up with a solution without really understanding the problem. So I guess I would say that, you know, being able to find out more and ask more questions and develop that relationship is really an important thing to do. And I don't think that, you know, you want to be too afraid to do that. And I've in the past kind of messed up before, and you know, but I'm willing to be wrong, and I'm willing to, you know, just see what happens. But you want to have that dialogue and discussion with that person. I don't know. What do you guys think?
So for me, as Alexa said, you need to show up. You need to listen and ask questions. When people show up, for me, that is the biggest thing that they can do, to put your face out there where African Americans are trying to move things forward and that you're there. Sometimes you don't always have to be the one who is speaking up, who is saying something. The fact that you show up consistently sends a message. When you sit in silence and don't show up, that's when it's a problem.
Thank you, Penny.
I agree with both persons, and particularly Penny. The idea of doing something about it. I think asking forgiveness and being sympathetic and even empathetic is very important. But I think the next step is behavior, actions to bring about change in policy and many other phenomena here in our society. So yeah, the forgiveness is very important. But again, the action, I think, is the very important next step. And it takes, as Alexa was saying, it's relationship. Better relationships that you have with individuals, I think the more likely they are to respond to you in a sympathetic fashion and more believable, from which action will follow.
May I add something?
Sure.
And I'm going to make a generalization here. So I told y'all not to, but I'm going to. And that is that I think white America in general, that is this is my opinion, lack introspection. And I think before you can do any of these other steps, you really need to find out, why are you afraid? Where does that come from? And really get clear about that and acknowledge that, but be very specific about that fear or those fears. And yes, it is important to build relationships with other people, and it's important to ask them whether they want to share that burden with you of educating you. And by those other people, I'm talking about the Black people.
Excellent point.
Thank you, LaTonya. Okay.
That's a really good point. I think the difficulty in really engaging more in this is that it's really a lot more difficult than we want to realize and recognize. I think it's really, I think it relies a lot on whites to understand a lot more than they do. And I think that it just takes time. There's not, it's, you know, when I was trying to put this together, there's no easy, like 5-step way to go ahead and make this happen. It's a process, and but you have to begin it, and you have to think. I think generally people have to think a little bit deeper about these issues. They're just, you know, we are kind of all fall on different stereotypes and bias and just our own kind of initial reactions. And you just have to go deeper. I mean, and it takes time, really. So, but you got to start. And the book that we both kind of referenced, but we didn't really get into it, but Kendi's book on how to be an anti-racist, it's a really wonderful book. And there's a lot in it, and it takes, you know, it's going to take some time to kind of go through all that, but it's worth it. And it'll help us be more informed about how we make our next steps.
Thank you, Alexa. Penny, did you want to say something?
Yeah, so, you know, I've been telling people for a few years, I'm tired of being uncomfortable. So if what I do and say makes you uncomfortable, good. Let's talk about it and see how we move things forward. But I'm also tired of folks feeling they need to have a safe space. They need to have folks to fall back on. Because as African Americans, when we walk out of our doors, and sometimes not even inside our doors of our homes, we're not safe. So waiting for it to be safe to say something or do something because it may be perceived as not quite right, you can't do it. We are dying. We are not being educated. We are not being allowed to live where we want to live. There's so many aspects of what is happening and what has happened in this country because people want to be safe. I'm not safe. You've got to change that. I can't. You've got to change that.
Thank you, Penny. Do we have time for one more question? We're going to keep going, I guess, if people need to
I think
leave.
we got time for one more question, Jane, and we need to acknowledge that we got many questions in the chat, and we got 12 questions in the Q&A. We don't have time for all of that today because we want to make sure to go ahead and close out the session, but how about we do one more question, folks? We're recording, and we will make the recording available, and we'll try to address the other questions in other means.
Okay, there are a number of questions, so I apologize if I don't get to yours, but let me answer. Several of them had to do with what are the books recommended and how can people see this program again or share it, and that will all be on the Dialogue on Race website, hopefully within the next 24 hours or so. Be patient. So there are a number of resources, those of you that want to understand internalized racism and what people can do to learn, change, grow. So this one, actually, LaTanya, is probably more for you, but I think any of you can answer this as well. One question had to do with the talk. And one individual asked, what percentage of parents, and I assume they mean Black parents, have to give this talk that could very well denigrate their children, but in the name of protection?
I mean, I don't think I can give that number because I don't have access to all the Black people, but most of the Black people I know, my parents gave me the talk or the talks. I am giving my daughter the talks. So I can only speak from my corner of this nation. And I would say all of the Black people I know that I encounter, that I have real relationships with, I know to be doing that.
Anyone else want to add to that?
Yeah, I would agree. It's protecting your children. And unfortunately, folks who don't understand that they need to have those talks, sometimes they happen too late when there is an issue and your child doesn't know how to handle it. So it is important, quite frankly, that we have those talks, because no matter where you live, and as has been spoken today, no matter how much education, no matter what your title, no matter whatever you think puts you in a different category, bottom line is if your skin is Black or brown, that's who you are. And you are not going to be treated the same way as white people. You need to help our children, or we have to help our children understand, be prepared, and be able to speak up when they know that things are not going right for them.
I'm also going to make a plug. People are asking about getting involved, and I did put that survey in the chat. So if people, attendees could fill that out, and it does list all of the groups that are part of Dialogue on Race. And that's the best way of being able to be active, because this group has done some amazing things and has been doing it for, what, 8 years, 9 years now? So, and has made some, excellent progress. So I really, the protests that we had in Blacksburg really we need to harness that injury, that all of those people into actually action group. So, but you guys already have laid the groundwork for that. So we just need to get them over to Dialogue on Race. So that was just a short little plug on that.
Yeah, and the community group, we're going to be looking at how we have more conversations around race. This one thing this pandemic has done for us is introduced us all to Zoom, and it is an excellent way, especially if you have masters like Andy and Lisa to help guide you through it, to be able to reach so many people and get this message out there. So if there are other areas that we need to talk about, and folks, I'm not talking about these things forever. I'm talking about, okay, here's some information. Now let's go out and help make a change. I'm not about sitting around talking, but so long.
So folks, we're gonna wrap things up, and we wanna, thank you, LaTanya, Alexa, Dr. Jones, Penny, thank you guys so much. You did a fantastic job. What a gift to our community. I know you spent way more time on this than you ever expected. Apologies. Thank you so much. We're gonna share the video recording once we get that rendered in a variety of ways. Dialogue on Race now has a YouTube channel, so we're hoping to build out a library there. We will share the links to the videos that were part of the PowerPoint presentations. Alexa did a great job of sharing the links to both the online form to give us feedback and to the resource booklet that was created as part of this. And as Penny said, there will be 5 more events online after this one to focus on each issue group and talking about the trauma theme for African Americans in our nation. Andy, would you like to say anything before we stop recording and close down the webinar?
Say thank you to everybody who registered. We had hundreds of people engaged, not just in Blacksburg, Christiansburg, Montgomery County, but actually nationally. We have people from San Diego, Montana, Tennessee, Kentucky. This is a purpose that we share as Americans, and we are called at this moment in our history of stepping up and reclaiming what it means to be the American democracy, to be the experiment that the world looks to for leadership. So thank you all.